Brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sell luxury holiday homes in top UK locations, with a potential 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at our flagship resort in Cornwall. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
It's the week ending Saturday the 9th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the US imposing sanctions against Vladimir Putin's inner circle, including his daughters, Boris Johnson defending his decision not to ban trans conversion therapy, and the death of former British and Irish Lions prop Tom Smith at the age of 50. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And as Olly's on holiday, I'll be taking the reins for a couple of weeks, and joining me today from the week's digital team, it's the boss man, Holden Frith, plus editors Kate Samuelson and Julia O'Driscoll. But Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A week of turmoil on the Teardrop Island.
Sri Lanka has declared a state of public emergency. An emergency of this extent is needed when a country is facing a medical disaster, bioterrorist attacks, responding to a calamity or a catastrophic event. But in Sri Lanka, the reason is different. It is this: public anger.
Holden, the WION reporter said there that the reason for Sri Lanka's state of emergency was unusual. What's the story here?
The story is really a long slow-motion crisis that really began to accelerate at the end of last week. So we saw violent protests on Thursday, which led to a 36-hour curfew and the declaration of the public emergency we just heard about. That closed down social media and messaging apps and allowed police to arrest people without a warrant. And according to Amnesty International, a lot of the people who were arrested were tortured.
I mean, that sort of a violent crackdown is likely to only further fan the flames of the people who are wanting to protest in the first place. But did it have any impact on the people in power themselves?
Yeah, there was a really big backlash to that, and it did reach into the government ranks. So we saw on Sunday the resignation of the entire cabinet, and subsequently the state of emergency has been lifted. But the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he still remains in place, and his attempt to appoint a new cabinet has not gone well. The new finance minister resigned after just one day, and then the president's party lost its majority after defections in parliament. And the protests have continued, and the crisis is still having an effect on daily life.
And Kate, what were people actually protesting about in the first place?
So the country is in the middle of really extreme cost of living crisis, which is impacting everyday Sri Lankans. Daily life is extremely tough for ordinary people right now. Last month, food prices increased by a record 21.1% on a year-by-year basis. But the crisis isn't just affecting the very poorest members of society. It's really cut across the entirety of Sri Lankan society. Because even if you have the money to buy food and essentials, in spite of these hiked prices, shortages mean that you just can't access them. And in many cases, this has been the situation for diesel. So people just haven't been able to drive anywhere. Some of the most hard-hit items have included rice and milk powder, which is a real staple in Sri Lanka. The price of milk has increased by 12.15%, so much so that some kind of cafes and restaurants are just not selling milk products at all.
Yeah, as you say, we're not talking about minor inconveniences here, are we? It's serious stuff. It's, power cuts of up to 13 hours and shortages of food and petrol and even medicine. This medicine in particular could be causing a lot of problems, Julia, with COVID still lingering around, right?
Yeah, massively. And Sri Lanka's doctors and medical community have been incredibly vocal about the problems that this is causing for the healthcare sector. And they've declared a medical crisis as well. It's worth noting as well that doctors have been warning for some time that there's been problems with shortages of drugs as well. And so the country has been kind of trying to overcome these issues with very little support from the government. And now it's kind of reaching this peak where, hospitals aren't able to function. As you said, Arian, there's power cuts. It's not a safe environment for people needing care. And doctors are warning that this is really just the beginning of what's going to be an incredibly serious health crisis.
And Julia, can you give us a little bit of background on the country and how it got into this situation in the first place?
Yeah, so as Holden mentioned earlier, there's been kind of instability and tensions brewing for a long time. And people are saying that Sri Lanka's experiencing the worst economic crisis since 1948. But if we think back to its history since that time, there was a long civil war of almost 25 years that culminated in 2009. During kind of the final years of that war, there was a massive tsunami in 2004, which killed 30,000 people and caused huge devastation to coastal communities. And then just years after that as well, there was obviously the horrendous Easter Sunday terrorist attack when 250 people were killed. And that was a massive tragedy for the country, but it also really hit the tourism and holiday sector hard as well. And Sri Lanka really relies on that sector for its income. So the culmination of all of those long-running kind of conflicts and tensions then have led to a situation where, exacerbated by COVID-19 and the subsequent impacts that's then had on the economy and tourism as well, has just brought this all to a peak.
Yeah, so there are obviously very serious reasons that people have gone out to protest, but Holden President Rajapaksa imposed this state of emergency, and then, as you said, he also lifted it this week quite swiftly. Was this a flirtation with a more serious kind of authoritarian crackdown that's now been averted, or do you think harsh measures are likely to be reimposed?
I don't think we could safely say that it's been entirely averted. Sri Lanka has used quite authoritarian measures on social media before, and in fact, in the aftermath of the Easter bombings, it cut off all social networking and a lot of communication. That was actually generally credited with averting reprisal attacks and the spreading of rumours through the country. So it's not necessarily a simple argument to deal with, but it is also part of what's been talked about as a sort of growing authoritarianism, a militarism of Sri Lankan society. The end of the civil war was incredibly brutal in Sri Lanka, and there's worry about political corruption and nepotism. The president's brother is prime minister, and a nephew was in the cabinet and actually resigned and made quite a strongly worded statement. But I think it is important to note that, as well as the bad luck that Sri Lanka has experienced with this sort of cavalcade of natural disasters, political disasters, civil war, there has also been some really quite bad political decision making too at the top of the government, and that's exacerbated a lot of these problems.
Yeah. I mean, Kate, thinking about that bad decision making that has brought people out onto the streets, there are some commentators who are now saying that there are direct parallels to the Arab Spring. I mean, is that what we're witnessing here?
A lot of people in Sri Lanka are holding the president almost personally responsible, well, the president and his family almost personally responsible for the situation that Sri Lanka is currently in. People are blaming him for decisions like tax cuts, which he put in place when he came into power in 2019, but as well as a kind of massive delay in terms of appealing for support from the International Monetary Fund. If that had been done earlier, perhaps Sri Lanka wouldn't be in the situation that it's in. And so people feel incredibly angry towards the president and his family. And the fact that the president and his brother, the prime minister, have remained in power while everyone else has resigned shows that it doesn't feel like this issue is going to be resolved, even though the president and prime minister are trying to create this kind of inter-party parliamentary coalition and promising to change things and kind of transform the political system. It doesn't look like it's going to happen while these two remain at the top.
Well, with that in mind, Holden, many people across the country and also within Rajapaksa's party are wanting him to quit. Do you think it's likely that he will over this?
There's no sign of it so far. He seems quite determined to reinforce his own position. He's adamant that none of this is the fault of either himself or his government. He blames it all on COVID-19. I think there's some justification for that. COVID-19 has exacerbated a lot of these underlying problems, as in fact has the war in Ukraine, which has led to a big rise in fuel prices that everyone has seen to some extent, also a rise in food prices, and in fact scarcity of both food and fuel and other goods. So there has been this sort of sudden deepening of a crisis, and he's determined to, as we've seen from governments all around the world, they're wrestling with local problems that have been exacerbated by international factors, and they're much keener to talk about the international causes of these problems than the local ones that might be laid at their feet.
Julia, to what extent do you think Sri Lanka's financial crisis is a warning to other countries in the region? And especially I'm thinking of India, whose economic situation is arguably as bad or worse.
I think it's a really good question. The fact that this story has been slightly underreported, given kind of the global situation at the moment, is also an important factor. But India particularly, I mean, it's already provided $1 billion of support to Sri Lanka for importing more of those essential goods and medicines that it needs. And Sri Lanka is asking for another $1.5 billion to help. And kind of that question mark of, like, how is the government going to use those funds? It's a big question. And India is really dependent on Sri Lanka as well for global trade. Colombo is a massive port that is needed. And it's one of its biggest trading partners. And so I think it's a real moment where, the government there is going to have to really question whether kind of the reforms and policies that have been in place in the country under the president's leadership are kind of a viable route, or whether this is a moment where kind of India's economy needs to go in a different direction and look more towards kind of self-reliance and its own income.
Even though the cost of living crisis that we're seeing in Sri Lanka is also being felt across other Asian countries, including India, as Julia mentioned, as well as Pakistan and Nepal, I think it's definitely worth pointing out that the situation is particularly acute in Sri Lanka because of its size and location. Because it's this small island nation, it's incredibly dependent on overseas imports to feed its population. And a lot of these imports are delivered by sea as well. So they've been really hard hit by a spike in import prices.
Yes, as you say, this is quite localized and specific in one way. But Holden, the broader picture is that fuel and energy prices are soaring internationally, and pandemic relief is still being delivered pretty haphazardly around the world. Do you think we are likely to see more countries suffering similar political collapses in coming months?
There's definite fears that Sri Lanka could be a sort of canary in the coal mine and could be highlighting problems that will come to other countries, and maybe particularly those that are dependent on tourism, as well as having relatively low national income and depending on imports of food and fuel. Tourism has been a huge source of foreign income, particularly for Sri Lanka, and hard currency such as US dollars. One of the sort of specifics of the crisis that Sri Lanka's facing is they just don't have enough US dollars to pay for the medical equipment, the fuel, the food that has to be paid for in hard currency rather than Sri Lankan rupees. And Sri Lanka has taken a very hard line on COVID protections. They essentially sealed themselves off from international tourists for 2 years. And it's hard to restart that industry from scratch. And also there's still a kind of a reluctance among a lot of people to travel, and airlines have been slow to build up their international schedules again because they're facing their own issues around fuel price and also shortage of labor. So there's really this sort of very complicated net of causes and effects, and the effects having knock-on causes which are really going to ripple around the world and have possibly quite unforeseen consequences for some time to come, I think.
Well, this is a fast-moving story, so I'm sure we'll be coming back to it in months ahead. But Julia, you're up next after this. Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Cornish cottages, campaigners, and a housing crisis.
We're actually producing some summer truffles as well now in Scotland, so I'd grate some summer truffles over that. After that...
Oh, it's not... Yeah, I'm salivating already, Gordon.
I'd go back down to the beautiful Cornish coast and get that line-caught sea bass and do that with a little light crushed potatoes. And trust me, I absolutely love Cornwall. It's just the Cornish I can't stand.
He said that, not me. He said that, not me. I made my boo-boo yesterday. All right, that's the G-man. That's nothing to do with me.
The familiar, slightly halting tones of Gordon Ramsay on Radio 2's breakfast show a couple of weeks ago. Julia, what's the story?
Yeah, so Gordon Ramsay hasn't got campaigners out in the street, but his comments definitely didn't help a situation that's been brewing in Cornwall for some time now. For some time, Cornish locals have been infuriated by the number of second home owners in the county and, the number of holiday lets and properties that there are that are left unoccupied for most of the year, while the county itself is facing a pretty horrendous housing crisis. And also kind of the second homeowners are pushing up the prices of properties in general. So it's really hard to buy a property for many kind of local Cornish people whose wages aren't at all comparable really to those second home owners' incomes. A new campaign group that was set up last year called First Not Second Homes. It has been organising rallies and demonstrations, and the actions have kind of reached a new level. So there has been this organised faction, but there's also just been people kind of graffitiing and vandalising the walls outside these properties. Recently, one was kind of a local pensioner went and just was so infuriated, took out a pen and wrote on the wall of these houses. So it just feels like we're kind of reaching a peak of local and non-local tensions are really spiking at the moment.
I mean, you say yourself that the business of people owning second homes in Cornwall is hardly a new thing. Why do you think it's coming to a head now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one thing in general is obviously we're seeing a cost of living crisis where people are thinking more and more about their homes and their household bills, and particularly if they might be able to get onto the property ladder. And house prices are up massively from the pandemic. I had a quick look at a couple of Cornish hotspots, and Padstow, which is where Rick Stein famously made his name. Average house prices are almost 600,000 this year, which is up 36% in 3 years. And obviously this does vary across the county in different places. And in some places where average house prices are in the millions, house prices are slightly down this year, but we are still talking almost seven figures.
Kate, for people trying to rent in Cornwall or also neighbouring Devon, I can imagine that there are hundreds of Airbnbs available now, but fewer long-term rental options. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So last summer, Anthony Mangle, who's the Conservative MP for Totnes, he pointed out that there were just 19 properties available to rent long-term in the whole of South Hams on Rightmove, yet there were 300 properties advertised in Salcombe, another 300 in Kingsbridge, and a similar number in Totnes. So people who are coming just for a short holiday, it's much easier for them to find somewhere, but people who actually live in the area, it's really difficult. And in fact, the situation has got so bad that Cornwall College, which has 8 campuses throughout Cornwall and Devon, and it offers courses in things like agriculture, business, zoology and construction, they've had to issue a plea to find suitable rental accommodation for students who are going to be beginning their courses in September 2022. They're actually having to appeal to landlords with a spare room to rent out in the area, and they're trying to get people to get involved with the government's rent-a-room scheme, which lets you earn up to a threshold of $7,500 per year tax-free if you rent out a furnished accommodation in your home. So there's a real housing crisis in the area, and this appeal from Cornwall College shows quite how bad things are for renters as well as for people looking to buy homes in the area too.
Yeah, Holden, we heard from Gordon Ramsay at the top there that he doesn't actually like the Cornish, and I happen to know that he owns a house, a massive house in Cornwall. I've seen it. It's in Rock. This must be causing a bit of a divide between locals and people like Gordon Ramsay and the other sort of multimillionaires who are coming and investing in a second home in their village.
Yes, it does seem that there's quite a lot of anger being directed to second home owners there, and I think the sense is that it's quite a parasitical relationship. There are people who turn up for a week every year to a house that otherwise sits empty. They drive in with a car full of shopping they've bought in London or en route at the nearest Waitrose. They don't spend any money in local shops. They don't interact with the community. They're not contributing a great deal, and they're sort of bed blocking this house that may be way out of reach of anyone who's actually grown up in the area.
Yes, I mean, that parasitic relationship, Julia, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Because second homes can end up destroying the fabric of the town that the person has bought into and kind of spoil the thing that made it attractive in the first place. So surely there's a benefit potentially to second homeowners themselves in putting some regulation in place here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you're investing, really significant sums of money into a second home, I mean, it's not just going to be the property that you want, it's the beautiful area, it's the gorgeous villages that obviously Cornwall is so well known for. And the campaigners who are calling for more legislation, that's kind of part of their argument, is they're saying you're kind of losing what Cornwall is really about. And it is those kind of, I feel like it's a very community focused county, and kind of retaining that is, there's also kind of a duty to retain that.
I mean, on the other hand, Kate, I read an interview in The Guardian with a former resident of Wadebridge who said that pre-Rick Stein, Padstow was, they said, a bit of a dump, and now it's obviously very pretty indeed. Is there a potential defence for second home ownership that it could be reviving some villages that would otherwise have disappeared off the map?
Yeah, there is definitely the argument that holiday makers who end up living in these kind of second homes, or second homeowners who come and use these second homes in the summer, they bring in a lot of money and they keep rural parts of the UK with very little employment in work. And I think it's important to differentiate here between second homes and holiday lets. A second home that's only occupied for a couple of weeks a year, I think, is a lot more problematic than a holiday let that might be rented out pretty much continuously throughout the year. There was a piece, unsurprisingly, in the Telegraph called "In Defence of Cornwall's Second Homeowners," which was arguing that locals can't really blame holiday makers for a lack of affordable housing, and actually it's more a problem with the government than with these individuals.
Yeah, I saw an interview with a woman who runs a cleaning business in Cornwall who was saying she actively wasn't going to clean any of the homes of people who were running Airbnbs or private rentals. And I suppose this must be a really serious question for people who live in Cornwall full time, because on the one hand, you do potentially have the benefit of tourism coming in and the potential to sell your house, if you own a house, for a much higher price than you would have otherwise sold it for. I mean, Holden, are there some upsides, particularly thinking about the tourism side of things?
There definitely could be, and I think that piece in the Telegraph was interesting, because she did draw a distinction between the second homeowners who leave their properties empty for the rest of the year and those who rent them out in between their own visits, and say, that's going to have much more of a positive effect on the local economy. I think part of the problem here does relate to the case study you talked about with Padstow, where perhaps it did used to be much more deprived, more run down. Property probably was in a worse shape. And the weird thing about the British system of property tax is that it's based on the value of a property in April 1991. And so that's a period when Cornwall would have been at probably its lowest ebb. And you'll have houses, sort of small seaside cottage in April 1991 would have been worth very little then. And now, having been renovated, gentrified, Airbnb'd, its value will have increased massively, but the council tax the owners are paying on that won't have increased to reflect that. So the council isn't getting a lot of the economic benefit that it could then pump into local services, schools, and if that could be corrected, then perhaps local people would have a slightly warmer feeling to the people who are coming in, and increasing the value of the housing stock and the sort of general services too.
I mean, this isn't just an issue in the southwest, though, is it? Julia, how have other parts of the UK dealt with the problem of second home ownership?
There are plans being introduced in Wales to increase the amount of council tax that second home owners or people who buy properties for holiday lets pay. So, as Holden was saying, that legislation that will help bring benefits to local communities that are seeing a real surge in holiday makers is underway. And Michael Gove is kind of looking to roll this out across the rest of the UK as well. So he is trying to bring in more legislation that will mean that, if you say that you basically, at the moment, you can become exempt on paying council tax if you say that you're going to let your second property as a holiday home, but you actually don't have to prove that you are. You just have to say you have the intention of doing it. Whereas now he wants to introduce legislation that means you will have to do it for at least 70 days a year. You will have to prove it's being advertised. And so that could make a massive difference in the UK.
Kate, what about Brits owning properties within the EU? Are other countries' rural villages being hurt by second home owning British people? And is Brexit having any kind of an impact on their ownership in the first place?
That's a really interesting question, and Brexit most certainly is having an impact on second home owning Brits. There are thought to be around 300,000 English-owned second homes in Europe, but Brexit really is changing things. As a result of Brexit, British visitors are now subject to ordinary non-EU citizen rules, which means that they're restricted to spending 90 days in every 180 days in the Schengen area unless they apply for a visa. And that is quite a complex process. It would mean a lot of extra costs as well as establishing some kind of tax footprint abroad. And so becoming a resident abroad, which is an option for some, is very expensive and not an option for others. And as a result of that, a lot of these kind of Brexpats, as the Times calls them, have had to sell up and move back to the UK. Although there are still a lot of campaign groups that are campaigning for things like a 6-month per visit visa waiver for UK nationals. So really, as a result of Brexit and then also lockdowns and travel restrictions imposed by COVID, people who can afford a second home have been increasingly looking at having that property in the UK, which has only really exacerbated the issue that we've been talking about.
I mean, does that mean, Holden, that we're likely to see, I don't know, landlords assembling even larger personal property portfolios, or will the changes that Julia was speaking about come to make some kind of a difference and prevent the business of home ownership from growing any further?
I'm not sure about that. It does seem that government of David Cameron, George Osborne was definitely making some moves that seemed to be actively trying to prevent people accumulating second homes, third homes, and sort of rental property empires. They increased stamp duty for anything other than your first home and started to cut back some of the tax incentives that encouraged people to become landlords. On the sort of Brexit side of things, I think that the lure of a warm climate may end up proving greater than the disincentive of some extra paperwork. So I think COVID plus Brexit has certainly had an effect. Whether once we get past COVID, people then start looking abroad again, I wouldn't make any bets there. But I would also not make any bets on a fundamental reshaping of council tax rules, just because it's going to create so much political pain whenever you make any of those. I mean, that's why we're still stuck with the April 1991 valuations, is that no government has wanted to poke that particular hornet's nest, and so we have been reduced to these sort of little bits of legislation that tinker around the edges and try and fix problems as they arise. But I don't think we're going to switch to a system that's used in some other countries where you just have a property tax system that's based on a percentage of the value of your home, which would massively disincentivize people, particularly people who already have expensive first homes, from buying an expensive second home too.
Okay, Kate, you're up next after this. Okay, Kate, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
People asking, "Hey Siri, are you sexist?"
You've probably noticed that Siri, Alexa, Cortana, and other personal assistant type programs tend to be female. There might be a reason so many digital personalities are women, and it's kind of our fault. When you interact with Siri, for example, what are you usually doing?
Hey Siri, what's the weather going to be like today?
Okay, here's the weather for today.
Most of the time, Siri is beckoned with a question or given a command, something like,
"Cancel golf today.
It's off your calendar."
She's basically a pocket personal assistant, and we've assigned her a female voice because that's what we're used to.
Leah Becerra reporting for US live news network Newsy back in 2016. Kate, what happened this week?
So for a while now, there's been some debate over whether digital assistants like Amazon's Alexa, Apple's Siri, Microsoft's Cortana, or Google's Assistant are sexist, because they generally have a default voice of a young woman, which reinforces stereotypical ideas of women being subservient and also well suited to kind of secretarial administrative roles. This school of thought was actually the subject of a UNESCO report in 2019, which found that such digital assistants actually entrench harmful gender biases. And it looked at the way that they respond to verbal harassment. For example, when Siri was called a slut by a human, the female voice responded with, "I'd blush if I could." And that was actually what UNESCO named its report after. But I understand none of this is new per se. But this topic was in the news this week because the Daily Mail reported on Sunday that almost £1 million of taxpayers' money is being used to fund 3 projects which are looking into how to reduce the gender bias of such digital assistants. These projects are being funded by UK Research and Innovation, or UKRI, which is a governmental public body. It's granted 3 separate grants for 3 different amounts, but the highest single amount was £462,000. And the news has understandably created quite a bit of backlash, with people questioning whether this is really the right thing to be spending nearly £1 million on right now, considering the dire economic situation that the country is in, where people are having to choose between kind of eating and heating.
And of course, the Daily Mail's slant was definitely, this is a waste of money. But it's 2022. Why is it that digital assistants generally still default to a female voice?
That's a really interesting question. In 2018, when asked about Cortana, a spokesperson for Microsoft told PC Magazine that they specifically chose a female voice to create a helpful, supportive, trustworthy assistant. And this is quite a famous school of thought. Tech companies are generally more likely to gender their voice assistants as female because the research shows that people like to hear help delivered in a female voice. And actually, there was an interesting piece in Vox which said that people prefer the sound of a male voice when it's making authoritative statements, but a female voice when it's being helpful, which is clearly quite problematic. But it does make sense that then when brand managers and designers are tasked with developing a voice for their tech product, they're opting for female ones because they're trying to reach the largest number of customers as possible and, to try and make the most money as they can from selling these products.
But Julia, there are now options just to change it. People can actually change the gender of the voice they're hearing if they wish to.
I mean, yeah, you can. And I think when I first saw this story, I was a little bit surprised because I thought, well, I know that I can change the voice settings if I wanted to. I guess maybe it's the fact that if it defaults to a woman's voice, then that is potentially a problem. And then as an individual user, you would have to kind of make an active choice to decide which voice you prefer, and maybe then some more conscious thought goes into why, the questions you're asking around why do I want it to be a male voice over a female voice. And it's a really interesting one. And I guess just also that these speakers this technology has been around for a while, and it started with the default being a female voice. That's what people expected. So now to kind of change what is quite a recent norm is going to take kind of an uphill effort, and it needs kind of individual users to be on board as well.
And I suppose the names, regardless of whether you've chosen a male or female voice, the names are things like Alexa and Siri that have a sort of traditionally a female connotation. But Holden, is it just the voices of these AI assistants, Alexa, Siri, Cortana, etc., that we're seeing this kind of tech sexism exist, or is it other places too?
No, there have been other complaints over the years too. I found a lot of stories from a few years ago about gender stereotypes in emojis. A lot of these have now been addressed, but there was a piece on CNN saying that there were no professional emojis depicting girls as of 2016, unless they said you count being a bride or a princess as a profession. And and it said girls tend to be wearing pink and to have long blonde hair. If you received a message saying, what are you doing today? The suggested emoji responses for girls brought up icons for getting a haircut or painting your nails, and for boys brought up rowing and cycling. And I think as well as being very obviously stereotyped, this also shows how with technology, these sorts of things can be more insidious than in other areas, because it's not easy to know what emojis other people are being served up. You tend to only see the things that are suggested for you. So you don't see these patterns and problems and sort of assumptions that are underlying it. Whereas if we were talking about children's TV, that's much more public and open, and something like haircuts and nail painting for girls versus cycling and rowing for boys would have been addressed long before 2016.
Kate, I saw a report that 5% of interactions with Microsoft's Cortana are unambiguously sexual, and it made me think, is part of the problem the user rather than the developer? Why are people asking their AI assistants dirty questions in the first place?
It's hard for me to answer that question because, I mean,
You're not in the 5%?
I'm not in the 5%. I have a Sonos speaker with a built-in Alexa, but I certainly don't ask it explicit questions. To be honest, that's just never even crossed my mind. But I guess some people like to push the boundaries and test AI to see how it will respond. I found it quite interesting to read about the writer Gemma Murray, who drew comparisons between these digital assistants and this sci-fi trope, which is called Born Sexy Yesterday. That's the idea of a kind of sexually developed female character presenting as being naive and childlike and lacking the experience and assertiveness that can be so threatening to men. You can see that in films like Her. And it's really popular in sci-fi generally. And I think there's something in that to sort of explain perhaps why people are quite quick to sexualize these inanimate objects and to experiment with them in some ways. But again, I think it's worth stressing that it's a really small proportion of people. And I think as well as it being a kind of sexual thing, perhaps it's also sometimes just kids messing around as well. And people, as I said, just kind of trying to test what the devices are capable of and how they'll respond.
Julia, how popular are digital assistants? I mean, are they growing in their use? Is the next generation going to grow up with a digital assistant as a default?
Yeah, they are really growing in popularity. Particularly, we saw that in America in the last couple of years. They've kind of really, sales have really boomed. And I think even here, like I now have a Google speaker, which was something I'd always been kind of trepidatious about, but I actually got it because it was free with a streaming service that I subscribed to, and that if it hadn't been free I probably wouldn't have. But just the kind of, they are being marketed more and more and kind of coming with other products and kind of normalized in a tech sphere, that as somebody who has potentially been quite wary of it in the past, now that is just, it's just becoming something you're used to seeing if you go into Currys or any other high street store where you might want to buy one.
I mean, with that in mind, is this not therefore a good use of taxpayer money to determine whether these things are inherently sexist or not, if it's going to be something that we're all going to be using?
Yeah, I think potentially. I also don't, I mean, it sounds like a lot of money. I don't know how much money this kind of research would require to really be able to do it and come out with actions that, can be quickly implemented and rolled out across kind of speakers that already exist. So I think it definitely would be worthwhile, but there has already been so much research into kind of how human bias infiltrates kind of artificial intelligence and algorithms. And so it does feel like surely there's enough already out there that can be drawn on, that maybe this money doesn't need to be spent, and, good solid conclusions could be drawn. And I do also wonder why it's kind of needs to be a government funded project as well. If it's these tech companies who are producing the product, you would kind of hope that they would want to make sure that the product hasn't got these issues. It's been reported before as well that there's kind of issues with not picking up female voices as well on these speakers. So you would just hope that there are people in the room who might be able to kind of give voice to why this needs to be addressed.
I think that question of who's in the room is a really good one, because I could easily imagine that, the sort of Silicon Valley companies developing these products are packed with liberal, progressive, well-meaning men. And these men perhaps were sitting around in rooms thinking, we've got to choose a default voice. Let's be progressive and let's put a woman's voice at the heart of this product. And if there wasn't a woman, or if there weren't enough women in those rooms, nobody at that point would be saying, well, have we thought about the fact that these are essentially personal assistants, and what are the gender stereotypes of that, and what will it mean if we put a woman at the beck and call of every user sort of at any hour of the day and night.
And of course, it's not just being in the room, it's being in the room and knowing that you have the authority, which kind of in the tech industry, we know women haven't historically.
Right. I mean, Kate, is this the answer here, that to stamp out the sexism in tech, we need to make the industry itself more inclusive?
Yeah, I definitely think it does come down to that. At the moment, only around 12% of AI researchers are women, and they only make up about 6% of software developers. And this all perpetuates gender inequalities later down the line. There's a really big issue with women in this industry. There's something called the leaky pipeline phenomenon, which sees women disappearing from the field as they advance in their careers, and factors like an environmental culture that's unfriendly to women are thought to be behind this. So I agree. I think a lot more needs to be done. There's a lot talked about getting women into STEM, which is really important, but I think also getting women into AI specifically and into these kind of softwares. And as you said, we're only going to begin to see more and more of these digital assistants. Studies show that there's going to be, by 2024, the number of digital assistants will outnumber the number of people in the world. So clearly that's not going to go away anytime soon. So I do think it is important to be addressing this, and getting women in the room and comfortable speaking up as well is clearly really fundamental to that.
Okay, Google, that's all we have time for this week, so stop podcast. And hey Siri, please send a note of thanks to Holden, Kate and Julia for their stories. And I'll be back again next week. So Alexa, put in a reminder to follow this show for free so you can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. Until next time, bye-bye.